Well, welcome, Lola McCann. I am very excited to have you on my show here. You and I have gotten to know each other over the last several years through a networking group we know together called Provisors. And because we both lead groups, we've gotten the opportunity to see each other in person, sit down, have dinner together as part of the group, and get to know each other. I'm really excited about the topic we are talking about today. But before we dive into it, let's hear your origin story. For anybody who is wondering, who's this Lola McCann? Uh, how did you get into what you're doing? And specifically, what got you interested in writing about this topic?
Sure. Well, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think actually it was over dinner that this podcast originated. We were chatting. So thank you for having me on. It's great to be here. And I'm an executive coach. So I support leaders and their teams in really achieving their very best, however they define that. And I like to say I'm a recovering HR professional. So I actually didn't know what HR was when I was in school. I don't think they even had a major around human resources when I was an undergrad, but fell into that career, spent a lot of really good years. So more than 15 years in corporate HR. And at the end of that 15 years plus, I was really burnt out. And I knew that the part of HR that I loved the most was learning and development and organizational development. And I knew that I wanted to be a coach, but I always thought, oh, that's going to be, most of the coaches that I knew had a very full career and then started coaching towards the tail end, like kind of semi-retirement. And so that's what I always thought I was going to do. And I think burnout and just dissatisfaction with where I was headed from a career point made me move that timeline up. And so in 2019, I started a company. It's called Intrinsic, and we provide executive coaching one-on-one and with teams. And we also do some leadership development workshops and personal development workshops. And so the topic that we're going to talk about today is one example of the types of things that I like to support leaders in developing in.
Well, before we dive into gender bias in the workplace, I note that you started in 2019 just in time for a global pandemic, right? Really quickly, did that in any way change your practice? Maybe it forced everybody to go onto Zoom and that helped. I'm always curious when people started something and then almost right away we have that hit. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, how did that affect your practice?
Yeah. I'm so grateful that I started when I did because if the pandemic had hit and then I felt this way, it would have been very easy to talk myself out of it.
Uh,
And so I had a full year before any of the wildness that impacted us, started to occur. I was also, frankly, very grateful that I was not the head of human resources when that hit because even just managing it on the fringes with my clients was bananas, right?
yeah.
There was no playbook, something wild was happening every other week. And HR leaders were really struggling to keep up and to know where to get good information from. And there were a lot of tough calls to make. And
Yeah.
so I was very grateful that I had already started my business. And what happened, I think, with coaching during the pandemic and certainly the couple of years afterwards is things got really interesting.
Mhm.
People started really questioning, is this the right lifestyle for me? Is this the right career for me? And so I had a lot of really interesting coaching engagements and still, but I think particularly 2021 through 2023, I saw a lot of really big questions around career pivots, and that was a lot of fun to work on. Not everyone ended up making a huge long-term change in their career, but I think a lot of people thought hard about it. So those were some fun years to be a coach.
Yeah. Well, I won't go down that rabbit hole. We have other things to talk about, but it that caught my attention when you said that.
Mhm.
You sent me an article or blog post that you wrote called The Tightrope. And it hit home for me, Lola, because I raised daughter. I'm a girl dad. I raised two daughters that are both adults. And the topic and your article really brought to light things that I've heard from them over the years as
Mhm.
they left college, entered the workforce, worked for a variety of different companies or types of companies. There was a similarity there. And in talking to my wife, Barb, she experienced that during her time. We work together now, but during her time in working, but she and I never really talked about it. It didn't, I don't think it really came up for you. And I'm just wondering, obviously, as a woman, this hits home and is almost right in your face. But at some point, it probably this light came on and said, this is gender bias. This is wrong. This is not a proper thing. Where I think if you go back through the history of the workplace, it goes back to the Mad Men days and beyond, right? Of the 60s and 70s. And I started getting my first job in the 80s. It was always there. At what point did that light come on or something happen to you to say, I'm going to tackle this. I want to talk about this. I want to help women with this.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because I it was something that kept occurring, right? But for so much of my career, I really didn't understand or fully comprehend consciously anyways what was going on, what those dynamics were. And so for so much of my career, Dan, I dealt with these different types of dynamics and I dealt with them internally, right? I hadn't done much reading on gender bias. I wasn't talking to other colleagues, men or women, about it. Often, when these situations arose or feedback came my way, I took it on as a Lola problem, right? And this is a personality issue. This is a behavior or a strategy issue for me as a professional. And I didn't really understand what was going on. And I would say that that was true right up through the end of my corporate career. And it wasn't until took a step back, changed professions, started coaching, and had more time to do reading on women's issues in the workplace that I really started to understand what had been happening all of those years and even a little bit about my own choices and behaviors because I was responding to something that I didn't fully consciously recognize, but I was trying out different strategies, right, to try to manage it. And so it's something that I've become much more conscious of over the past, 6 or 7 years. And with that additional education and the chance to talk to colleagues about it, it's gotten a lot easier to manage. And so that's what I really want to see for other women is let's create a dialogue and understand what some of these dynamics are so that we can manage them better, so that it doesn't feel like such a personalized thing.
I have so many questions coming out of this, and maybe the first one, and I maybe this should have been the first question in your definition, how you define it. How do you define gender bias? So anybody, whether woman or man, looking at a situation can identify it.
Mhm. Sure. Well, and so I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on bias or gender bias specifically. What I can share with you is what I've read about and what I know from experience. And so our brains operate with a sense of bias. Everyone has bias,
Mhm.
right? And so this isn't necessarily a genderized issue entirely. Our brains are wired so that we take shortcuts, so that we make generalizations, so that we can understand the world around us in the most efficient way. And so our brains are wired, we have bias, right? It's also very difficult for us to recognize our own bias. It's easier to recognize it in other people. And when I think about gender bias, I think about behaviors that are traditionally associated with gender. So there are certain sets of behaviors that are deemed feminine, right? A good woman tends to behave in this way. There are other sets of behaviors that are deemed masculine. So a good man tends to have these traits. And so when I'm talking about gender bias in the workplace, what I'm really trying to hone in on is this duality of expectation, especially for women professionals, where we still have all of the expectations, like the social norms around how a woman should behave, but sometimes they are in opposition with how we think about how a leader should behave, right? Because that tends to be a little bit skewed towards acceptably masculine behaviors.
And so in your article, which I will make available with your okay, I'm assuming I will make available to everybody who's watching or listening to this because it's really good. You wrote, lean too far into masculine traits and you're a bitch. Too far into feminine and you're sweet but not a leader. That is an example I would think of this tightrope and what you just described. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. And that's really getting at the heart of the problem because for women in leadership roles or trying to get into leadership roles, you know, there are specific behaviors that are tended to be seen as leadership and also masculine. So when I think about being authoritative, right? In order to be a leader, we need to be authoritative
Right.
to some degree.
Mhm.
We need to be able to influence, we need to be able to command a room. And that is rather in line with traditionally masculine behaviors. Like it's okay for a man to be assertive, aggressive, commanding, right? And in order to be seen as leaders, women need to take on some of these behaviors at times. It's absolutely critical. At the same time, if we want to be successful long term, we have to be likable, right? There's
Right.
just no way around it. You have to be seen as communal, collaborative, emotionally intelligent in order to be a successful woman in the business place.
So does that, I mean, I think women knew this even going in, whether they called it gender bias or not. I think they would look at that and say, okay, I've just been promoted or I'm looking for this. Do you think that keeps women from just being themselves? Just because you wrote in here, and I'm going to keep going back, you wrote something about your one of your own stories about you're thought to be too stoic, right?
Mhm.
And or something like that. Does that keep women from really just saying, I'm going to be myself, I'm going to lead like I know how to lead, and I'm not going to worry about anybody else? Because as a man, I would say, I would think a lot of the best leaders just say that I'm going to do it, I'm going to be me.
Yeah. Well, and so I think that how we define ourselves, right, it changes over time. It matures over time, hopefully, right? As leaders, as people, we're growing. Now, I like to use the word authenticity, right? And so a lot of the coaching work that I do is around supporting leaders in finding their authentic leadership style. And so, yes, I mean, when we are up against a bunch of pressures to act a certain way, either in masculine type of behaviors or feminine type of behaviors, it can get in the way from our authentic leadership style, right? And there have been times, I can't necessarily say that my early career stoicism was me being authentic,
Yeah.
right? I was nervous. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the story goes back to an early career promotion, right? I got promoted into this HR business partner role and I was really excited about it and I wanted to do a good job. I also had very little experience doing what they were asking me to do. And so my response to that was to be very prepared, very
Mm,
buttoned up, very much all business, right? Because I was trying to show my competency, my
right.
credibility. And what ended up happening is about 3 months in, my boss came to me and she's like, "We got a problem. Your clients don't like you," right? They don't like you. You're too stoic. They don't trust you because you don't talk about yourself. And I was supporting some really big operations groups at the time. She was like, "They don't like you." And I realized at that point that I was leaning far too
Mm.
into traditionally masculine behaviors, right? I was being very commanding and like they need me to know what to do, so I'm going to tell them what to do. And what I really needed to do was lean further into feminine traits and be seen as likable and collaborative. And so what I ended up doing at that point is I had to slow down and I had to spend a lot more time just engaging with them as people,
Yeah,
right? How are you doing? How's your family? What did you get up to over the weekend? What are some of your hobbies? And I would remember these and ask them about it. And then I also had to start talking about myself. So I couldn't be so buttoned up anymore. And what I did at the time, I had a 2-year old, my firstborn, I had a toddler at home. And I wasn't comfortable sharing my whole life story with these clients because I still was nervous, right, about
right.
them seeing me as credible. But I could tell them stories about my toddler because he was funny and it was relatable. A lot of them were parents. And that was my place to say, okay, I'm comfortable sharing this. I'm going to slow down and intentionally share stories about my toddler.
Yeah.
And it's amazing the response, over about a 6-month period, I really saw that shift. I saw our relationships get better. Yes, they saw me as competent, but they also saw me as trustworthy.
Do you think, and just in this larger topic, do you think that if it was a male who was nervous, who was trying to be very professional, who came across very similar, do you think somebody would have come and said, your boss would have come and said they don't like you? Or do you think that those are two different things?
I'll say it's entirely possible that the same complaint could be lodged about a man behaving
Right.
that way. However, it's not as likely.
Okay. Yeah.
I believe that it's more acceptable. It's more in line with traditional gender norms for a man to be all business, to be sometimes curt, even, to be commanding, like, I'm going to tell you what you should do here.
Right.
And so that's where I'm not saying that men don't come up against the same problems because
Mhm.
look, men deal with gender bias too. It's just a little bit different. Like
Right.
you have your own gender norms to manage. And, I've met sales leaders who seen as incompetent because they're too nice, right?
Mm.
Male sales leaders can be seen as, oh, well, I don't know if that person can really lead a big team because they're just too nice.
Yeah.
They don't have the authoritative style that we need, right? So it does cut both ways. I just think that women have a lot of this to manage when they're trying to be leaders as well.
In talking to my wife Barb and my daughters, one of the areas that they said that they've encountered a gender bias has been from other women. Could be bosses or supervisors, and it might be because those women in their career, when they went through their professional lives, it happened to them, and that was their way. That's all they knew. Have you encountered that?
Yeah, I have. And, as women, we each find our own way of dealing with bias, right? And one of the things that can happen is when when our strategy for dealing with bias is different from another woman's, we can tend to be a bit judgmental about that,
Mm.
right? Like okay, this woman's strategy is to lean pretty far into masculine behaviors and I don't like that. That's not my strategy and I can't relate to that, and why is she doing that? And vice versa, right? And so unfortunately, I said before, we all have bias. Women have bias too. And I think what you're touching on here is a difference in strategies, right? A
Uh-huh.
difference in how we are responding to the same issue. And so certainly, I have seen where I've worked with a woman who just won't even acknowledge that there's gender bias happening in this situation. And her strategy was to ignore it and act like one of the boys and just hope that it goes away, right? This doesn't touch me because I'm not even going to acknowledge this. And for me, like that wasn't quite my strategy. And so I had to really look at, okay, I can understand where she's coming from. I don't need to judge her way of dealing with this, even though it's different from mine. But certainly, women do judge other women about this topic. And that's, you know, when I give this talk to a live audience of women, I tell them stories about the ways I've managed things. And I sort of invite that sense of judgment from the audience because I want them to experience what it's like to judge other women for this. And then I'm going to call them out on it at some point in the conversation, right? I'm going to say, some of the things that I've shared with you today, you might be judging me a little bit on, right? And that's okay. That's normal. But I just want us to be conscious of what's happening here. That like, ooh, I tried out this over here and that didn't go so well and it doesn't make me look so good. But we can also try to suspend our judgment of how we're dealing with this because we all have to get through it.
I love how you're making this real and human because we all as humans, that's where bias comes from. There's judgment and often we say we try not to, but it's human nature. I want to now flip this a little bit and maybe move towards what you advise, whether you're working one-on-one coaching somebody or whether you're speaking to a large group moving forward, especially maybe for as we go through as we record this, there's a lot of graduations happening both in high school and college and young women moving into the workforce. What kind of advice would you give A, women who are feeling challenged with this, and then B, young women who are making their way into the workplace?
Yeah. So I'm really going to offer three pieces of advice. And the silver lining here is that I think the generation of women who are graduating right now and entering into the workforce, I think they're a little bit savvier than I was, right? Maybe savvier than the women in your life who you've described, right? Because there's more information out there and the dialogue is much more open. And so the first thing I'm going to say is educate yourself. Understand these issues so that they don't feel like personal issues, right? It never needed to be a Lola issue, right? Like I needed to learn how to manage it, but it wasn't just me. And I spent a long time thinking it was just me. And so I always offer reading recommendations. This is an excellent book. It's called What Works for Women at Work, and it's by Joan Williams and Rachel Dempsey. It's fantastic. It's chocked full of different biases and how women have managed them, and it gives case studies. It's really good. If reading a whole big fat book isn't your thing, there are a lot of great podcasts out there. So the first one is really just to educate yourself so that it doesn't feel like a personality issue. It's not. A lot of this ends up presenting like, oh, well, it's just your personality. It's just your behavior that you're a little bit too much of this or not enough of that, right? And so that's the first one. The second one is to talk with other people about it, right? Men and women, talk to colleagues, discuss, okay, this is the situation I'm running up against. Here's what I've thought about doing about it. What have you done in the past? And so when I get groups together to talk about this, there's always a breakout discussion. And we always talk about where have you seen this show up for you? And what have you done about it? What's worked well? Which side? So if we talk about just the tightrope bias, the tightrope is balancing between these masculine and feminine, expectations
Right.
of your behavior. And so do you tend more towards feminine or do you tend more towards masculine? There's one study that showed that actually 73% of women experience the tightrope bias, and two-thirds of the women who say they experience that bias, they tend to lean more towards feminine traits. And so they're being held back possibly in continuing to be seen as a leader and growing because, oh, they're just so nice, right? They're really nice. They're a team player, but they're not really leadership material. That's usually what's happening. And so talking about it really it creates a sense of support and community that I didn't have going up through the ranks in corporate. And then the third thing that I really recommend is back to our conversation about authentic leadership, is being willing to experiment with how you respond to some of this and trying things out until you find what feels authentic to you. Because, you know, we can perform in the workplace, but when it feels like we're performing most of the time, that probably means we're in the wrong workplace. That probably means that environment is not conducive to us being ourselves.
It took me the whole time of us talking, and this little light came on in my head, and I thought of this, and I want to share it with you and get your thoughts on it. The word bias, probably over the last 5 years or so, probably has gotten a bad rap. Bias in and of itself almost seems to have a negative connotation. What you've really talked about is what is our expectations of a masculine or a feminine, male or female, what the role looks like. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It comes from experience. It comes from when you where you were, how you came up in your professional life, how you were raised. There's a ton of reasons why any of us would have expectations. This is really about, in a sense, managing those expectations first and foremost with yourself and understanding that, and then understanding that other people have those expectations that came from perhaps a whole different world. And that just kind of hit me as you were talking. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, again, I'll say I am not a bias expert.
Right.
I've read and I have experienced. What I'll say is this: when it becomes a pattern of expectation,
Hmm.
that's when I tend to look at it as a bias, right?
Okay.
We all have these experiences and expectations, but there are certain patterns that show up again and again. And so when we're talking about gender bias, we're talking about the patterns that are associated with being seen as feminine or a woman. And so I think we all have bias. Now we can decide whether we think that's good or bad, but we all have it. Unfortunately, when we have these pervasive patterns in the workplace, it can do a lot of harm.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're really looking for. And I've just touched on one type of bias today, right?
Yeah.
So the when we perpetuate these biases, it can create a lot of harm and it can exclude equal representation in leadership. And that's when it hurts everyone. You know, when you have a board, when you have a leadership team that isn't very diverse, they're not performing at their best. They're not supporting the full employee population in the way that they could be. And so that's the real shame here is that when these biases, when I think create such frustration for women that they opt out,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well, I keep being told I'm not leadership material, so I'm not going to lead. That's
Mm.
sad.
Yeah. So I want to give you the last word. What is a question that you wish I would have asked you, and want desperately to answer, or what would you like to leave everybody who's listening or watching this with?
Sure. I think what I'd like to leave everyone with is a sense of optimism, right? And it is a little bit of a double-edged sword. I have a daughter. She's about to turn 12. And I don't think gender bias is going away for her. You know, there was this promise for my generation from the women who came before me that, oh, you know, we're pushing for equal pay and we are welcome in most workplaces and our daughters shouldn't expect to experience a lot of gender bias. And what's happened is we have, and we've really experienced this kind of second generation gender bias that sits kind of underneath the surface and people aren't overt about it, but it's still there. So I think that for our daughters, I think it's still going to be there. So that's the hard part. But the optimism I the optimism I have is because I watch my daughter, right? Like we talk about this stuff. My work is very visible to her, and I'm raising a different kind of girl. Like she has so much confidence and she knows who she is. She was ecstatic a couple weeks ago because she was elected her second year as a student body, senator for her class. She attempts things, Dan, that I never would have even imagined doing at 12, let alone at 20, 25, right? So I do have a real sense of optimism that as we continue to educate and discuss on this topic, it is going to get better, but the problem isn't gone.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This has been really great. I have three granddaughters to boot, so I'm watching them. When you're talking about your daughter, it made me think about my 7-year-old granddaughter and some of the things she's doing and the confidence she's showing. I'm thrilled about that. Somebody watching this or listening says, I want to connect with Lola. I want to talk to her about her coaching. I want to talk to her about her practice. I just want to connect. I want to read more or listen more to what she's doing. How do people get in touch with you or get your information?
Yeah, so they can check out my website. It's www.intrinsicnow.com. My company is called Intrinsic. I have a monthly newsletter where I write about topics. So the article that you referenced today, that's one of my newsletter items. It's going to come out in July. And so I'd love to get in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, I'm always interested in having a conversation. So.
Perfect. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Lola. This has been a lot of fun. We'll have to do it again sometime soon. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I'll have all of the information in the show notes. For now, I'm Dan Weedin. This has been the Chasing Unleashed podcast. So long.